Okay, good morning. Thank you all for joining us today. This webinar is brought to you by a grant from the New York Farm Viability Institute and the New York Corn and Soybean Growers Association. This webinar is part 3 of a 3-part series of discussions focusing on farming in a changing climate in New York. The recordings of all 3 webinars will be available on the farmland.org website. So certified crop advisor credits will be made available for today's talk, but unfortunately the CCA website was down, so I couldn't apply for the credits prior to today's meeting. But I will do that as soon as I can, as soon as I'm allowed, and then we'll send out the information once we have the credits approved. So if you would like to get that information, please email me, Aaron Risto at aristo@farmland.org. We'll also send out it in our email blast. So if that's how you heard about this webinar, then you'll also get it through that. But if you want to make sure that you get it, please email me. Today's presentation is intended to be a discussion and questions are encouraged. During the presentation, please post your questions in the chat. We will also provide time at the end of the presentation for additional questions and discussion. Today, we are joined by Dr. Gilbert Jenkins, who is an assistant professor of agricultural science at Morrisville State College. She earned her PhD in environmental soil chemistry from the University of Delaware in 2008. Before coming to SUNY Morrisville in 2015, Dr. Gilbert Jenkins taught at Villanova University at the Weston School. Her diverse research interests include soil health and agricultural sustainability, urban food production, and fertility requirements for grain and fiber hemp production, as well as hemp for phytoremediation. Dr. Gilbert Jenkins will be discussing New York State Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act draft scoping plan today, and how the plan will specifically impact agricultural production as the state aims to reach set greenhouse gas emission reduction goals. It is a pleasure to welcome you, Jennifer, to share your perspective, and thank you.
All right, good morning. I just wanted to note that I can't see the chat while I'm sharing my screen, so please at any time just unmute yourself and ask questions. I'm more than happy to have this be a conversation. It's a bit of an information dump in the beginning, and then we'll have lots of time to chat and converse. Okay, so the draft scoping plan is dense and full of all sorts of information. And when it first came out, very quickly, we started hearing feedback about it, whether it was positive or negative feedback. And I thought, there's no way that anyone could have this type of feedback already. There's no way that they've done a deep dive. So I decided that my capstone course for my agricultural science associate's degree program this semester was going to focus on the draft scoping plan. And so day 1 of the course, I introduced the process and the plan to them, and they have been just swimming through this for the past 3 months. So we're going to talk a bit about what we learned that's in the plan, what we learned from a little bit of outreach that we've done, and where we think we're moving forward. Okay, so in case you aren't aware, the draft scoping plan is based on the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act that was passed in 2019. And it's an incredibly ambitious law that requires New York to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 40% by 2030 and by no less than 85% by 2050. And so what that means is not only do we need to be net zero carbon, but in some cases we need to actually be below zero carbon emissions. So this act created the Climate Action Council to develop a plan for how in the world are we going to implement the goals set in this law. Right. There were 3 components of that. We have to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, increase renewable energy use, and ensure climate justice. And those threads work throughout the entire plan. We thought it was really interesting to look at what these actual targets were, right? So not only is it that 85% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, but 100% zero emission electricity by 2040, a complete conversion of our electrical grid, 70% renewable energy by 2030. So meaning in 8 years, we need to increase from the 20 something or 30-ish% renewable energy up to 70% renewable energy. That is a tremendous jump. Focusing on offshore wind, energy storage capacity building, and solar building. As an aside, we looked into how much land would be required to meet the solar goals, and the estimate that we found was 40,000 acres, which at first my students were floored by. They were like, oh my God, that's such a huge amount of land. And then we took Google Earth and plotted out on New York State what 40,000 acres looked like. And it's such a small amount of land, they couldn't believe it. So it was really interesting for them to see that, because they've received the message that solar is here to compete with ag land. And if you drive around our region of central New York, you see no more solar on our ag land signs everywhere. And I think this is we've gotten off to a rough start. I think we need to do better at describing what these solar goals are going to be and where they should be placed, right? And so make sure that our agricultural community understands that this land is not in competition with our best cropland. But that was a key piece of some of the work that we did, realizing that messaging has been really poor so far. And so to fill the void, there's been a lot of negative messaging that we now need to undo to get people on board and make them realize that these are all targets and goals that are going to be helpful and improve everyone's life. And it's not going to be here to hurt what anyone's doing, right? And then this 22 million tons of carbon reduction through energy efficiency and electrification. So if you go to the draft scoping plan and look up agriculture, this electrification piece doesn't come up. And so we have to sort of understand that there are components of the draft scoping plan that directly impact agriculture. And then there are components of the draft scoping plan that will tangentially impact agriculture. And this is one of them. And so we'll talk a little bit about electrification of large farm equipment. Right. So who's on this Climate Action Council who wrote the draft scoping plan? There are two main organization chairs, the DEC and NYSERDA, and then the council member agencies are pretty extensive, really a nice range over all of the sectors of the state. So I think they did a good job of making sure that all the sectors had a seat at the table. Right. And then outside of state organizations, there were appointees that represent the industry that is going to be most involved in the processes. And then there was also a professor from Stony Brook and a professor from Cornell. Right. So a pretty good mix of needs were at the table for writing this plan, right? And the main mission is this, to create a green economy and clean environment for our future, right? But I think it's important to look at our three focus points: environmental justice, healthy communities, and a bright economic future. The bright economic future is just as important as all the rest of that. And so a lot of folks' first response to this was, oh, this is all too expensive. There's no way, no one's going to adopt any of these things. Well, what we found going through the draft scoping plan is that there's just carrot after carrot after carrot, and there are very few sticks in this plan. The goal is to entice people to be engaged through help and not through not through negative reinforcement. Right. So the environmental justice piece comes in for agriculture, looking at reaching out to communities that are currently not represented in agriculture in the state, and trying to increase the overall diversity of the agricultural workforce. There are grants all over the place for this. Then the clean environment portion of it, when we're looking at the transforming how we generate electricity, that really comes into agriculture in a number of places. We'll talk a bit about manure management and methane digesters, and co-production of electricity through that is greatly supported through this plan. In agriculture, the reducing air and water pollution really comes into the practices where we're looking at, the main agricultural practices that we're looking at for crop production are cover cropping and reduced tillage and overall nutrient management and soil health practices. And so they all tie into that reducing air and water pollution piece, right? And every single part of this research project that my students did, they came up with this engaging the community piece is the most important, because as they were reaching out and talking to people, they realized just how many people don't have any idea of what's coming or what this is all about. So that was really heartening for them to see that the engaging the community component is a piece of every part of the how are we going to implement the draft scoping plan across the board. There was talk about outreach education, outreach education, outreach education. My students have struggled to be able to do that piece, and and yesterday we're having a conversation with some folks at Cornell that's their goal, is to do the outreach education for the climate law. And what we found is that in the past 5-ish years, certainly because of the pandemic, we've relied more and more on electronic forms of communication. And because of that, people are pushing away from electronic forms of communication, meaning they don't check their email as often, they don't respond to things in their email as often. And so getting the word out, even getting the word out about in-person events is difficult. And so that engaging the community piece is so important, and we're going to have to be really creative about it. Okay. So that bright economic future piece, there's a whole lot of money for workforce development and infrastructure improvements. And I think that agriculture will really reap the rewards of this component there. Okay, so there's a lot of money on the table here. They're talking about $21 billion in renewable projects across the state. For renewable energies, 6.8 billion to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from existing buildings, just under 2 billion to scale up solar. I mean, this is really huge. So as we looked through the draft scoping plan, my students kept coming back to this, kept saying, okay, this is all going to cost money. Oh, wait, but they're earmarking the money for it. So there's going to be the support behind this to make it happen. Right. So in the draft scoping plan, under the agricultural it's agriculture and forestry section, there's a set of visions for 2030 and a set of visions for 2050, meaning how are we going to make it to all of these earmarks in such a short time frame. There is a big focus on manure management, and this is where the first set of inaccuracies started been reporting about the draft scoping plan. People were saying that it says we have to get rid of animal agriculture, and there is nowhere in the plan where animal agriculture is demonized or said that it needs to be gotten rid of or said that it's not important for the New York economy. That doesn't exist at all. What the plan does say is that we need to increase the use of manure management strategies. So for smaller farms, meaning better composting of manure, and for larger farms, more incorporation of methane digesters, with the understanding that methane and nitrous oxide emissions are a key component of greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture. And so if we do a better job of managing those methane and nitrous oxide emissions, then we will instantly pull down those emissions. So part of it is manure management, part of it is animal management, and increased research focus on diet, and looking at how do we limit the amount of emissions that come directly from the animal by improving their ability to absorb nutrients directly from their diet. So I was really heartened as a scientist looking through the draft scoping plan to see in just how many spots it says, and we need to devote more dollars to research in this area, and we need to devote more dollars in research in this area. So there is an understanding that we have goals, that we have goals that we may not be able to answer completely at the moment, that all of our technologies may not currently be in place, but that over the next 20 years, we might do better. And so we need to continue to invest in those opportunities. The agriculture and forestry sectors are seen as the opportunities for the state. So in no way is agriculture being blamed for anything. The ability to store carbon in the soil and in long-term wood storage in our trees is seen as the only way to reach our goals. And so contrary to some of the feedback that I've heard, what is actually happening in the draft scoping plan is that agriculture is being promoted across the board, looking at ways to ensure that we don't lose any more agricultural land through more land preservation, and improving the implementation of practices that we already have so that we can sequester carbon. So agriculture is seen as the solution, not as the problem, right? So in that 2030 vision, we're looking at avoided conversion of farm and forest lands. So making sure that as our communities grow, that we do planned development and don't just keep planting houses on farmland. So look for places where we can reforest when that's an option, but focus on our crop management practices. Soil health practices comes up over and over and over, which is near and dear to my heart. And so we're looking that by 2030, we can store 30 megatons of carbon dioxide equivalents of carbon, right? That's a lot of carbon. That's by 2030. Last time I looked, it's 2022. That's 8 years from now. So this is a really focused, quick implementation of the practices we already have and using the tools we already know how to use. Then looking to 2050, this is where we're bumping up the technology that we're going to be using, right? And so there are technologies that we don't already have. There are solutions that we don't yet know. And that's what's going to be required to get that final push, right? And as part of this, there's a recognition that our bioeconomy, our plant production, our in-state production is so important. And so there is funds available to promote more farmers markets, to promote more food stamps ability to be used in farmers markets. And in fact, in this year's budget, there is a state program that doubles dollars for food stamps being spent at farmers markets, so that not only can lower income people enjoy the benefit of fresh produce, but that fresh produce will come from in-state. So all of this work to make sure that the agricultural production in the state is supported, and to reduce food miles. So we're reducing transportation costs of bringing food from all over the country into the state by making it more feasible for folks to be buying food that we grew here. So that's really huge. And there's a couple of other ways that the bioeconomy is going to be supported, but I thought that focus on food production in New York State to divert the import of food from other places to reduce transportation miles is a big piece of this. And what's sort of interesting is that the draft scoping plan recognizes that there is the potential for what they call carbon leakage. So by enforcing stricter rules here, we might push carbon to be emitted in states around us, because maybe it becomes cheaper to do what we were doing here there because of these new rules and laws. And so any point where those types of activities are identified, they need to be rectified. So to make sure that we're not reducing carbon emissions here just to see them increase somewhere else. Right. And you know, if we look at this year's fiscal budget, and I just pulled this off of our budget website last week, right? There's almost $17 million set aside for climate resilient farming in this year's budget. So this is the list of funding specifically for environmental benefit in this year's budget. There's an additional piece that was about both farmers markets and improving access to farming for the BIPOC community. So there's more funding for agriculture than just this year, but it was amazing to see just how much is already going into our climate resilient farming without the draft scoping plan even being passed yet. So the goal is that when we get that final scoping plan in place, we can implement right away. Right. The question has come up a few times: how is the money going to be distributed into these pools? We already have lots of federal programs that support the practices that are being encouraged. And in the draft scoping plan, it really specifies that soil and water conservation districts are going to help at the local county level for the implementation of these plans and the ability to target farms that can use more funding to help. So the key strategies are broken down in the agricultural section, are broken down by main topic, right? So there's livestock management. And as we've already talked about, there is the goal to advance alternative manure management. And so, as we were saying, that includes both composting as well as methane digesting, and then advancing precision feed, forage, and herd management. The draft scoping plan says a whole lot about Cornell and the School of Forestry at Syracuse, at ESF, working on the outreach component of all of these plans. And selfishly, I just like to say that I think Morrisville is going to be a big piece of this as well, because of the populations that we work with, both in the forestry area, but as well as in ag engineering, and then agronomy and dairy. And so we expect to be full on involved in this moving forward. I always feel our need to stick us in there. Okay, so for livestock management, we've already talked a little bit about what they're focusing on, but soil health, nutrient management, and agroforestry. So the fact that this comes up in 3 or 4 different places in the draft scoping plan is to really promote soil health practices, to work on keeping our soil covered through cover crops, disturbing the soil as little as possible through reduced tillage. I mean, there's just so much in there over and over about the importance of these strategies, not just for good agricultural production, but also for improving carbon sequestration. So that was really exciting for me to see. Then the piece that comes up all along is that we can't forget the economics of these practices. And so everywhere along here, looking at how these practices and how implementation of the plan is going to impact the economics of the community comes up repeatedly. And then the third piece was this focus on that bioeconomy, as we were talking about before, and looking at replacing current products that are derived from fossil fuels and expanding the use of renewable bioproducts made in the state, either replacing coal with wood pellets, which seems a little bit counterintuitive at first, because part of this is supporting forestry growth, but it's with the understanding that forests need to be sustainably harvested, and therefore making sure that there are good markets for those sustainably harvested products. Looking for alternative sources of biomass feedstocks, things like hemp for fiber, I think is going to be a huge component of these bioenergy products moving forward. So there's a lot here for the agricultural community to be able to benefit from. All right, so what did my students do? So my students jumped right into this plan and tried to learn as much as they could about it. So a lot of that is sort of the summary that we came up with about what's in the plan. But then they wanted to see what else, can we understand more about the implementation of this plan? So their goal was to analyze the impact of the draft scoping plan on New York State ag, to look at what are these recommended actions, to see where do we need to do outreach education, and to engage in the legislative process to understand that everyone's voice needs to be heard. And so they focused on manure management with methane through methane digestion, electric farm machinery, cover cropping, and reduced tillage. For manure management, they were looking at the fact that we really had to be promoting the right products to the right farms, that composting is more effective and realistic for smaller farms, whereas methane digestion for farms with a medium to a large herd size would be more beneficial and more realistic, that smaller farms just can't maintain a methane digester. But with the trend of farm consolidation in the state, that the numbers of farms where digesters would be appropriate is increasing. So one of the things that they were looking to do was to figure out how much is our farms in the state already doing, and therefore what is the opportunity for increase in practice implementation. So if you already have 90% of your farm is doing a practice, And this practice is being associated with a huge carbon sink credit, but you only have 10% of your farms to be able to implement that practice on, you wouldn't be able to reach that carbon reduction. So they set out to understand how many people are already doing the practices that they looked at, right? And they quickly found how expensive the implementation of methane digesters are, but that the ability to generate electricity from them offsets that cost. And so there's a lot of opportunity for better carbon management through this tool. And so we sent out a survey, and we sent out the survey through a whole number of venues. I mean, I think we sent it out to a few thousand people, and unfortunately only got 15 responses back, which was very, very sad. But that's okay, because what they did learn from this, because of the 15 people that responded, they were all across the state. I think the 15 responses represented 13 counties, and we had people from the Hudson Valley, the Capital Region, Central New York, Western New York, and Northern New York. So we were just missing Long Island. And I think we had the Binghamton area as well. So it was interesting to see that the people who responded to our survey were all already engaged. They were all already participating in federal programs to support the types of practices that are being suggested. The majority of them were already cover cropping at least some of their crops or some of their rotations. The majority of them had some amount of reduced tillage on their farms. And so what we saw was people that were willing to answer the survey were already the people engaged in this process. And the fact that the survey was sent out to so many people, and we had a really sad small response, shows us what a job we need to do at engaging more people, because the opportunities are really there for people to benefit from these programs. But if folks aren't willing to engage, then we're sort of at a loss, right? Of the people who responded there, I think there was only 2 of the 15 that would actually be large enough for a methane digester to be realistic, and one of them already had one. I believe of the 15 that responded, 60% were in dairy, and I think it was sort of 20% small grain field crops and 20% fruit and vegetable production. So then we looked at electric heavy equipment, and the first thing that the students did was research, what companies are even looking into this. And they couldn't believe that every single heavy equipment manufacturing company, it doesn't matter if it's Deere, International, Kubota, everyone has either an electric line already available or an electric line advertised as the next thing that's coming out. And I think this is really important, because when you hear people say New York's law is too strict, or New York's law is going to put us out of business, or things like that, it's ignoring the fact that major companies are already trying to reach the goals that we have in this law, and that private industry is already moving in this direction. And so our law is just going to keep us up with what industry is already doing. So instead of us enacting a law and then industry having to catch up, this is actually happening in the opposite direction, that industry is moving forward and we're implementing a law that's going to help us catch up or stay in line with what industry is already doing. What we've heard back both from our survey, but also from talking with stakeholders that we've seen face to face, is that two key questions have come up. Can these new pieces of equipment run for 12 to 14 hours at a time? And how long do they take to charge? So are they actually going to fit into our farming systems the way that they need to? And then the concerns regarding implementation came up when we realized that new equipment sales are only a small fraction of equipment sales in the state each year, that used equipment sales are much greater. And therefore, that means that the implementation of this technology is going to be delayed 10 to 20 years as folks purchase equipment that is 5 to 10 years old, 10 to 15 years old. And so the new equipment is going to slowly come online. And as that becomes available to purchase used, right, then then those later adopters will be able to come in. But farmers really highlighted that funding is a barrier to adoption, and not only funding of the purchase of the equipment, but also understanding that electric costs, paying for electricity is incredibly expensive. And so the authors of the draft scoping plan also recognize this. And so not from the agricultural component of the draft scoping plan, this excerpt here is actually from the building component as we talk about electrifying everything. And they reference the fact that electric rate structures will need to evolve to be supportive of and appropriate for higher levels of electrification of buildings and vehicles, with attention to equitable rate design, so that we can't be paying the same electric rate for turning on our lights as we do for charging our vehicles. Just like farm diesel doesn't cost what street diesel costs, there needs to be a way of supporting this rate structure. And so I think it's really heartening to see just how well and how thorough the authors of this draft scoping plan were, recognizing the fact that this is going to be a barrier to implementation, and therefore they're coming right up front and saying that we're going to need to work on these electric rate structures to make it so that this is even an opportunity for implementation. Okay, so cover cropping and no-till. It's interesting to see that these are practices that are already happening, obviously, around the state. And I think it's wonderful that in the agricultural sector, right, that we're working on soil health. Like, that is where the carbon benefit is going to come from in crop production. But the students wanted to try and see if they can understand where the practices are already being implemented. So say this type of crop production is already doing either cover cropping or no-till, or both, right? Because those practices need to go together. But if this sector is already doing it, maybe we need to focus our outreach efforts over here on this sector where they're not doing it as much, right? They want to see, can we tailor how dollars are spent? And unfortunately, because we had such a small response, it was more difficult for us to be able to tease that information out. But we would really love to to be able to look into that. Oh, so I'm looking in the chat right now. There's a question about how will the electrical grid be evolved to support electric equipment that our current grid wouldn't be able to supply the demand. That is absolutely a piece of the plan, is for infrastructure building. And so the funding going towards that goes into workforce development and new jobs creation to support the number of jobs that are going to be needed to improve our electrical infrastructure. So I think one of the things that jumped out to me was the understanding that there are going to be jobs that are lost, right? The fossil fuel industry in the state is going to go away. And so we're going to have fewer gas stations. We're going to have fewer demand from gas stations. We're going to have all of that industry is going to shrink, right? And we're going to switch. And therefore we need training in this new side of the industry, and there'll be jobs created in this new side of the industry. And so just like over time, we didn't need candle producers anymore because we had light bulbs, and we didn't need cart and buggy producers anymore because we have cars mostly. This is a point of shift, and there's recognition that there's going to be job loss, but there's also recognition that there's going to be job growth. And so that transition and that workforce development, the state is funding colleges doing workforce development training like crazy right now, so that we can convert folks who have been in this sector and get them over to this sector. And I think that that's good planning at the moment because of all this. Right. But back to our cover cropping and no-till. We saw that relative to national averages, New York State is below the national averages on both cover cropping and no-till implementation. And so we have a whole lot of work to do. And talking to farmers in the area, I hear all the time, cover cropping, or it's difficult in our state because of when we get our crops off. Okay, we can talk about that. But also that no-till doesn't work on my land. Right, no-till may be okay on that land, but it doesn't work on my land. And so I think that we have a lot of work to do in breaking that perception of these practices, right? So cover cropping is limited by harvest timing, but there are opportunities for intercropping that we're not doing so much in the state to improve the implementation of cover crops. There's more that we can do. But no-till is really where we have that huge opportunity for expansion of practices. So the students' main conclusion is that, man, do we need more outreach education? And that outreach education is important for stakeholders as well. One of my students called every soil and water conservation district in the state to find out about acres of cover crops or acres of no-till that they've funded in implementation, and to talk a little bit about the draft scoping plan. And he was amazed at how many of them, of the people that he talked about in these districts, didn't even know about the draft scoping plan yet. So that was a little disheartening to him. So that understanding that there needs to be outreach education to the stakeholders, as well as to the community as a whole, right? That we have this opportunity to really increase no-till or reduce tillage practices across the state. There really is some carbon reduction credit that we can get there. And looking at those technologies like our electric machinery, that it needs to be clear to the target audience how the technology is going to benefit them, and not just be a switch that they have to do for environmental reasons. So we were pretty excited about the conclusions that they were able to come up with, but it seems like our key takeaway is that there's a whole lot more education that needs to be done around this draft scoping plan. And to that end, I wanted to make sure everyone knew about the public hearings. There's one today in Buffalo, and then May 3rd in New York City, and then the 7th and 11th of May are both virtual public hearings. And so if people are interested in that, you just have to go and pre-register for them, and then you can attend. Okay, so that was a whole lot of chatting, so, or me chatting. So now I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and so I can see the here. So it looks like National Grid is already working on improving the grid, which is great to see. So that 40,000 acres is like what percent of farmland in it? So we looked at how big that would be in Madison County, and it was like 2 towns. It was just a teeny tiny amount of land. Not that anyone expects, you know, an entire town to go away and be covered with solar panels, but that if that's spread out over the whole state. And so that's also assuming that this is all new land being converted into solar land. One of the things that we talked a bit about was, can we quantify the amount of acres of big box stores and targeting big box store roofs for solar panels? Because they're all flat roofs, and so get no shadow during the day on we'll get constant direct sunlight. And so I think that there's all sorts of opportunities there to not look at this as only a stealing from agricultural land. How much would electric vehicles increase that? What about biofuels? So I think that biofuels are absolutely an option, but biofuels take land away from food production or feed production, right? And so there's a trade-off. I think all of that is possible. How do growers who are already adopting practices of cover cropping benefit from? So that's a really good question. I think because it's a continual practice and you are continuing to sequester carbon, I think that you get to participate in whatever carbon credit payment system that they come up with. And you know, we were talking yesterday about the fact that there needs to be a system for checking on implementation, a system for going and saying, okay, you said you're putting in 20 acres of cover crops, but 10 of those acres failed. So now you're only getting credit for 10 of those acres, right? So there needs to be a verification system. But I think that there is recognition that the benefit from reduced tillage and cover cropping is ongoing, and that you continue to sequester every year, and therefore you should be able to benefit from those programs. I hope. I mean, I'm pretty sure that's what I read in those, but it all comes down to implementation, right? So that's what it says now. And biofuels do have lots of high value livestock feed and byproducts. And along with that, one of the goals is to keep organic waste out of landfills. And so looking both for composting options of organic waste, but also feed options of organic waste, connecting sectors through the state so that restaurant waste can become animal feed or can become compost, right? So that we're looking at drawing bridges between sectors that may have been diverse and separated in the past.
All right. Are there any other questions? I have a question or two, but you can also join in with your audio. You don't have to write a question if you'd want to have make a comment or, yeah. Michael, did you want to say
Hi,
something?
this is Mike Gardner. I just wanted you to back up for a minute. Maybe I missed what, your reference to 40,000 acres. What was the 40,000 acre footprint supposed to produce?
So we looked, we did a little bit of searching and tried to figure out how many acres of solar panels would be required to meet the electric needs of the goals in the plan. And so the figure that we came up with was 40,000 acres. Now, there are two caveats on that, and that is, I'm not exactly sure if that is electric needs of the state as is now, or electric needs of the state as we electrify. And the second is that's dependent on the level of solar panel technology now. But if the past 20 years are any indication, our panels are becoming more and more and more effective. And so that acreage maybe will stay the same as the amount of the electrical demand goes up, right? But our technology increases also.
Right. It just seems like 40,000 acres, if you were talking about replacing, the need, the power need for New York with 40,000 acres, it's nowhere near the number.
No, and I think that was.
So I think you're talking about the target, trying to achieve those targets.
And the target as a
growth.
component of total electrical production, right? Because we're not trying to go totally solar. We're looking at offshore wind as well, right? There are all these other pieces there as well.
Right. So it was the solar component you were talking
I think so.
I guess the other, just another comment. It's interesting because we're doing a deep dive in our organization with some other people right now in this whole area, and encouraged that you took a unique approach at Morrisville to do this in a class. So you got, that's encouraging, because you're going to have some people coming out of there that are in tune with this challenge that's in front of us. The interesting thing that we, when we're out in the grower community, those that are aware of this, but this climate, this New York climate issue, how much they don't want to talk about what they're already doing, in terms of what they have on the land, because they want to get credit for it in the future in there. So there's this thing going on where,
but I think that they'll still get the credit for the future.
Well, that's the key. I think that's a very key thing. Our mind works in the direction of, it shouldn't be fixed to, what you've been doing. It's, what are you going to do, and then continue to get credit for doing those things in that way. That's not very clearly understood out in the general crop production farming area. So they're very concerned about, to anybody that calls them what they're really doing, or track with what they're really doing in there, because they want to get credit for this when it's actually kicked into gear. So this whole carbon thing is also extremely undeveloped and unidentified, and isn't tracked scientifically yet, to the detail on the farm. And you made some comments along that line in there, and we see that's where the real need is, to try to drive this out to the farm in a way that's scientifically documented, and that it did actually produce these changes, and then actually tracked within a system that you can say that it was done, and it was done in an adequate manner.
Yeah, and I think the piece that I didn't talk about at all, because we had very little luck finding good detail about this, was what is the carbon credit opportunities going to be? Because there's going to be a carbon economy where people could get paid for not just implementing these cover crop practices or these reduced tillage practices, but those payments are just to offset the cost of doing the practice. Then that currently exists, but there's also going to be carbon credits that people will be able to be paid for. But there is very little information of what that carbon credit economy is going to look like. And so that's going to be an extra carrot along the way.
I agree.
Yeah. And I use students because they're forced labor and they're free. Works out
This
well.
is
for
being
me.
recorded. While we're running out of time, I did just want to ask if maybe in closing, I thought maybe a good way to sum up is, what would you say to a farmer if they were saying, okay, all this is happening, it's sort of in the future, but it's also very close at hand. So what would you suggest that a farmer do now to get ready for this, or to be involved, or just in general, what should they do?
So I think the most important thing for a farm to do is have a conservation plan, right? To start with a conservation plan through the NRCS so that they can think about what are the opportunities on my farm with my production system? Where are my opportunities to then go and say, oh yeah, I can do no-till in this here on these fields. Or if I am doing this rotation, here's how I can put cover crops into that you start with your conservation plan, and then these opportunities show themselves. Whereas if you don't have that conservation plan to start with, you can't participate in any of the programs, and you can't, it's not as apparent where the best benefit it will come from. And the NRCS didn't pay me to say that.
And also soil and water conservation districts, you can start there too. Or cooperative extension. There's going to be a lot of people involved here to support all this work. Well, Jennifer, thank you so much for your time, and I appreciate everyone jumping on this morning, and your engagement in the discussion. So thank you so much. Like I said, this will be made available soon on the farmland.org webpage, and we'll send out an email about CCA credits, but please email me if you want to make sure that you get that link to the information to apply for those credits. So with that, thank you, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your week.
Have a great day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.